You don't owe your first date every single excruciating detail of how awful your breakup was, or how terrible the relationship was, or how you're so happy you got out of it. You don't owe anyone that level of vulnerability. It's a reactive state you're entering into because it's a dynamic that you think you have to obey. Are you possibly sharing because you've gotten into a routine of oversharing as a means to find approval in the world around you? Welcome to Mindfully Sovereign, the podcast that invites you to reclaim your feminine self-authority and unleash the abundance within. My name is Sapha, I am your host, and I'm here to help guide you past your limiting beliefs and into the heart of your unwavering and undeniable power. This podcast is all about reclaiming your feminine self-authority, learning the art of self-seduction, and awakening your inner goddess so that you can become an aligned match to your most abundant life yet. So grab a cup of tea, get cozy, and get ready to become mindfully sovereign. Hello, and welcome back, beautiful souls. We are diving into one of my favorite topics today, and there are lots of little places for us to look at perspective, nuance, context. So I want to dive right into it. So, what we're going to be talking about today is vulnerability. And I know that on the one hand, this has become a very popular term, something that gets thrown out a lot, especially in the spiritual community. This is something that we talk about often, and often it can feel very dense, or there can be this slight misunderstanding around what actually being vulnerable means. On the other hand, this is one of those taboo subjects, or had been a taboo subject for a very long time, and it can feel very triggering. It can feel very dense, it can feel very heavy, it can feel very scary for a lot of us, especially for those of us who have gone through trauma in our lives in one form or another. So, this is a topic that not just looking at the word in itself, which I do have a definition here that I'm going to read verbatim in a minute, so bear with me, but not just looking at the word and the definition, but the energetics, the thoughts that come along with it, the information that goes along with it, and because this show is all about you learning to fine tune that muscle of your personal power, your mindful sovereignty. We're going to look at all of this through the lens of what it is like to have that mindfully sovereign presence of mind in the world of vulnerability and what it means. So, we're going to take some of that bitterness away because it's not, when we speak of vulnerability, we're not talking about saying or telling everything about you and giving every part of who you are to everyone in your world at all times without any kind of healthy boundaries, without any kind of healthy understanding of self, or without any kind of intention behind the share. So, before we get further into that particular realm, let me pull up my little nerdy verbatim definition of what vulnerability means. So, in the context of living a more fulfilling human life, vulnerability can be defined as the courage to be open and authentic, allowing oneself to be seen and known without the mask of perfection or invulnerability. It involves the willingness to embrace uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure, recognizing that true connection, growth, and fulfillment come from being honest about our fears, desires, and imperfections. So, vulnerability is, in a sense, a superpower. It goes hand in hand with authenticity, it goes hand in hand with intimacy, and it goes hand in hand with mindful sovereignty. Vulnerability allows us to get closer to the people in our lives. It allows us the room, or it provides us with the freedom to show up as we are from a place of authenticity and empowered action. And it opens the door for personal growth, creativity, innovation, and compassion, not just with ourselves, but with the world around us. So, vulnerability really is a very healing tonic, and it has the power to help us build trust in ourselves, in the world around us. It allows us to exercise in a way that muscle of understanding what it is like to grant access to self with power, with love, with dedication, with devotion. And it doesn't demand that we put ourselves in a position where we can be hurt or taken advantage of, or where we are going to expose so much of ourselves to the wrong people in the wrong way at the wrong time in the wrong measure just because. And so that's where the conversation around vulnerability gets so much more beautiful, and where we can gain so much more potency for self empowerment. For many of us, it doesn't feel this way or look like this, but really, vulnerability helps us develop a vast amount of personal strength. It catapults or broadens our sense of emotional regulation and self awareness. And it really opens the door for deep connection, and not just to the world around us and to the people around us, but connection to self. The more vulnerable we are able to be with ourselves, the more we will be able to open the door for true connection with the people and the world around us. And we're going to do that in a healthy way, keeping our boundaries in mind, keeping our hearts in mind, keeping our self importance in mind, keeping our mindful sovereignty intact. And at any given point in time, we can lean into our internal power and our understanding of ourselves to bring us back to center through authentic living, through vulnerable living, through understanding, through caring, through loving, through devotion of self, through self for the self. And so authenticity really is this beautiful aid in our journey to develop ourselves and to live a life that feels fulfilling, deep, fruitful, abundant, lush, rich, and just delicious. At the end of the day, vulnerability doesn't have to be about exposing the self in a way that is going to endanger us. And I know that this is a lot of where we feel that push and pull. I know that this is where we feel that fear, that we think that in order to be vulnerable, we have to give access to everyone in our lives at every single moment, during every single day to us, right? And it's actually not that at all. True vulnerability is, again, by degrees. Not only is it by degrees and increments, but it's also a place for us to be very deliberate and intentional in choosing who gets access, where they get access, to what degree, why, what is the intention behind it. And so I think where we get very sticky, or what I have observed at least in the realm of spiritual development, self-help, and personal growth, is that we do hear vulnerability is important and it is a superpower. And we internalize that, and we believe that what it means is that we have to always show up from a place of, this is my truth, or we think we have to bring everyone in to what our reality is. This is the kind of thing that gets activated when we go on a first date, for example, and we start trauma dumping on someone, believing that we are being very honest and very truthful, very authentic, very vulnerable. And what's really happening is we are in this state of overstimulation. We have things that we haven't sat with, that we haven't courted, we haven't dated internally long enough. And before we know it, it's this verbal diarrhea that is just spewing forth. And we are telling the person, we are giving the person access to every single last bit of our lives, of our hearts, of our minds, of our experience, our lived experience as human beings. And that is where things can get very dangerous, particularly particularly, and take this from someone who has had to deal with a couple of narcissists, actual narcissists in her life, is that this is where we get ourselves into difficulties when we think that wearing our hearts on our sleeves in this way is the only way to receive love. When we come across people who will weaponize that empathy, that honesty, that sincerity, that beautiful way of sharing of the self, we'll take that and then flip it and use it against us. And this is where a lot of that friction, a lot of that pain, a lot of that wounding has taken place. The other part of that is too that we sometimes forget. We do live in a world where we try to put a certain mask isn't the right word, but a certain level of presentation of self toward the world around us. And the reason I'm bringing that up and why I phrased it that way is think about it in these terms. Do you remember a couple of years ago when the amazing Brene Brown came up with some of her earlier work and she was talking about vulnerability and how important it was? And if you haven't read her work, please read it. She's fantastic. There's so much richness to what she is sharing in terms of understanding vulnerability as a point of self authority in this world. And she says it in ways that are just only she could phrase them that way. But the reason I bring this up is when this came to the forefront in our society, in our culture, one of the really interesting things that started to happen was that people would take to social media and they would record themselves crying or feeling angry or moving through an emotion to show just how raw and real and vulnerable they were. Now, I've said this before, I will say it again. Anytime you are in a position where you feel like the actions that you are taking are being utilized as a way to present proof positive that you are worthy of love, worthy of cherishing, worthy of respect, worthy of being seen, held, supported, loved. All of these things, anytime you are in a position where you are acting, you're taking steps from that place of, I'm going to do this so that I can have the proof that I need, the evidence that I need, the gold star on my forehead that I need to show people that indeed I am worthy and I am deserving of these things because I have done these things and I've checked them off the list. What you are doing is putting yourself at the effect of something. You're also putting the world and the people around you on a pedestal where they are up here and you are right beneath them, and they're the only ones that have the say as to whether or not you are fill in the blank, right? And you are putting yourself in a situation where you are no longer compatible with your true aligned self, meaning your authentic and vulnerable self. And so, is it beautiful to show up and say, my heart is broken today. I feel very heavy and I really would like to be held or supported in this way? Yes, that is amazing. Are we able to share a very personal moment? Again, I'll go back to social media just as an example. I'm not picking on anyone, but just as an example, are we able to share an intimate, painful, very uniquely personal moment on social media as crying or going into a beautiful wooded space and doing a somatic kind of movement and just filming that? Yeah, there is some beauty to that too. The key is, for me at least, to have a very clear, present mind as to the intention of the share. And it's the same in the example of the first date. I don't want to share and overshare, in fact, and be vulnerable If it's not coming from a place of true, authentic self care, true, authentic presence, true, ingrained, mindful sovereignty and devotion, we want to be clear as to what the intention and the greater context is. Because if I am taking a video of myself when I'm crying and it's one of the hardest days of my life, and I want to say, listen, if you are feeling alone, if you are feeling heartbroken, you are not alone. There's nothing wrong with you. This is good medicine, and the intention is going to be in alignment with that vulnerable share. If the intention and the context are out of tune, if the resonance isn't the same, what's very likely going to happen is that I'm going to subconsciously, if not consciously, place myself in a realm of performative action as well as reactive action. And while I might be very sincere in my share of this vulnerable space, this vulnerable moment, in the back of my head, if that intention isn't crystal clear, if my connection to self isn't crystal clear, if I'm not aware of the greater context of where this desire for connection or where this desire for the share is coming from, then I'm very likely putting myself at the effect of something else, and I'm opening up myself to lending or granting trust for people who are not to my highest good, who are not going to see that and have a beautiful, loving welcome, but who might then weaponize it and who might then utilize this against me. And so it's for me where mindful sovereignty really comes into play in the realm of vulnerability is understanding the self, is understanding again the bigger context of what is going on. When you are in conversation with someone and you are being vulnerable about something that happened in your life, about an experience that you had, about a trauma long gone, where are you? Are you present in that moment? Are you connecting to the person that is with you in a very real way? Are you projecting? Are you listening? Are you granting this trust point, this access point to this person because you've been in a way of getting to know them really well, in a way of building a relationship where you can feel safely held and supported and seen and cherished? Or are you sharing this vulnerability because you believe that the mere fact that this person is in your life means that you owe them access to these parts of who you are? Are you possibly sharing because you've gotten into a routine of oversharing as a means to find approval in the world around you? Are you addicted to the connection that you can create with a person when you share pain that the other person will be familiar with? We see this a lot, and this is not the only aspect of this. So please, a little bit of grace with this statement because I don't have time to go into the full scope of this particular subject today. But this is what we see a little bit in the realm of trauma bonding. So, yeah, vulnerability is wonderful medicine. We can't live our lives wholly protected and insulated at all times. We can't live with walls up. There was a conversation I was having with someone, and I can't remember who it was. And it might have even been Emily who was here recently. But I was saying the thing about for me, the imagery of being overprotected in within the self, for the self, right, is this idea of a thimble. So a thimble completely protects your thumb when you are sewing something, but at the same time, it also completely engulfs you. So, living a full life that feels rich and abundant and loving and connected and expansive and empowering is not so properly attuned when we believe that building walls is the only way to keep ourselves safe. Because at the end of the day, it may temporarily feel like we are safe behind these 360-degree walls, these thimbles that we put around ourselves and not letting people in and keeping everything really close to the vest. But we are very likely doing ourselves one of the greatest disservices of all time, not to mention how that in and of itself can also be very potentially dangerous if we ourselves are not surrounded by people who have our best, most highest well being in mind. And so living a life that is hyper protected doesn't work. Vulnerable connection is a great integrator. It is a great intimacy builder. And it still doesn't mean everyone has access to me all the time, 24/7, no matter what. Everyone gets to hear about my deepest, darkest secrets. Everyone gets to see my trauma. Everyone gets to hear the story about when this happened. Everyone gets to have access to me. This is where those boundaries are so important. You're going to hear me say this probably ad nauseum just forever, because boundaries are such a beautiful part of self integration, self devotion, self reclamation, self empowerment, right? And when it comes to vulnerability, they have to go hand in hand. Your vulnerable share, your vulnerable beingness gets to, it doesn't have to, but it gets to walk hand in hand with your power to create healthy, sustainable, very self aware boundaries in your life. It also gets to walk hand in hand with your ability to grant trust from a place of self authority. This means, no, you don't have to be vulnerable with that person just because you've known them for 25 years. This means, no, you don't have to sustain a relationship at such a deep level with a person who you just met 5 seconds ago. This means, no, you don't have to grant access to every single part of your life, to every single one of your family members. And it doesn't mean that you're a bad person for establishing a boundary within those familial or friendship or even romantic relationships or connections. One of the things that I hear a lot in the entrepreneurial space, just because it is so unique, our world really has created a space of systems. And when we break the mold, when we go outside of those systems, it can be very confronting. It can be very triggering, and it can be scary, not just for the people around us who love us, who want the best for us, but for people in general to try to wrap their minds around what it is that we are doing. I had a conversation with my stepdad once, whom I adore. He's one of the most wonderful people in this entire world. And it was so funny to me because to him, moving in a world of entrepreneurs. My entire family, we're entrepreneurs. We're very creative. We love exploring and doing things. And we were just not built in a way that we would feel great and thriving and alive and just exuberant in a standard 9 to 5 behind a cubicle kind of thing. So pretty much all of us have done something or other in our own way, and all of us are entrepreneurs in one way or another. My stepdad very much has lived, he was in the same job for decades and decades. And so he, from the outside looking in, he was telling me, it's funny because I don't quite understand it. I don't understand this drive to want to be your own boss. Like, if I could just go into the office and make a bunch of money and, go home and be with my wife, and I get that. And so I bring that up just to say, be mindful. You don't always, as entrepreneurs, sometimes we'll go and say, oh, I had a bad sales month. I didn't make my goals, or I didn't sell this program, or I didn't sell this thing that I was working with and I feel very down about it. Now I'm trying to figure out what the next angle is going to be. And to us, this is a vulnerable share that we are imparting or that we are sharing it. I didn't want to repeat the word share, but there it is. It's a vulnerable share that we are sharing with the people around us. And it doesn't always have the response that we want, especially with family members, those who love us, who worry about us. And a lot of times and speaking with my entrepreneurial friends, we will laugh because we'll say, okay, I said this and this to my family. And they immediately were like, well, you should get yourself a 9 to 5 job. Why are you still doing this? Why are you still trying this if you're failing or if you're not seeing the results that you want? And it's very difficult to do this. And it's coming from the most beautiful, caring place, and it's not helpful. And so, the reason I'm bringing this example up is to say when it comes to vulnerability, you can be vulnerable with the people who are closest to you in your life and still not share every single aspect, every single moment, every single second, every single pain, every single thing about you and your life and your heart and your emotions with them 24/7. Sometimes, in fact, it is much better and it will build a deeper intimacy between you for you not to do that. And so it's good for you to be present again with the self, with the context, with where the share is moving from, where it's coming from, and to the degree to which you want to share of yourself and of your life, and where the healthy boundaries are going to be established. Maybe it's a healthy boundary for you to say, no one in my family has access to my social media, or no one in my family really, we're not going to get into conversations around this area of my business, right? You have people in your life that you create community with, that you can have these conversations with, that you can have this level of vulnerable surrender with, that you can have this level of openness and truthfulness with, that do not necessarily have to be involved in every single area of your life. If you're at the office and you are sharing something vulnerable about your heart and your life and your day with someone who maybe isn't in that alignment with you relational wise, it's going to feel jarring when they shut you down or say, well, let's focus on getting back to work, or dismiss you, or don't enter into a productive conversation with you. So we don't have to give of ourselves all the time. We don't have to record ourselves crying and put it on Instagram all the time. We don't have to prove our vulnerability to the world around us in order for our vulnerable shares in the moments where they do come from a place of mindful sovereignty and of our choosing, right? Come along. You don't owe your first date every single excruciating detail of how awful your breakup was, or how terrible the relationship was, or how you're so happy you got out of it. You don't owe anyone that level of vulnerability. Drop into presence, take deep breaths. What is the context? What is the intention of the share? Are you sharing this because you do want to deepen that intimacy, because you do want the other person to get to know you better, because this is your authentic self? Great, share away. Are you sharing out of habit, out of a subconscious patterning of over giving? This is one of those where when we talk about people pleasing, sometimes we don't know or recognize or understand that oversharing also falls into the realm of people pleasing. And it is this giving of self, give more and more and more of myself. I hear this all the time, conversations where no matter how much I give and I give and I give and I give, I never get it back. And I was one of those people. I was always one of those people. I think it also has to do with the way that my brain operates. And it was also a trauma embodied action. Just thought that that was the only way for me to again present proof proof positive that I was worthy of being seen as someone who could be a friend or mhm. So it's still people pleasing. It's still saying, "Oh, look how amazingly vulnerable I can be because I can cry in front of you," or "Oh my gosh, look how amazing vulnerable I can be because I can tell you every single detail about my torrid upbringing." There is a time and a place and a way and an organic breath and depth to the conversations that we get to relish in when we are our most authentic, most vulnerable selves. And it does get to operate within healthy boundaries that allow us to choose. And listen, sometimes we are going to share our most vulnerable selves with someone who, in that moment, receives it, loves it, gives it a safe space, and we feel amazing and uplifted and delicious. And then a little bit later, something might change. They might decide they're going to share something that they weren't supposed to. At some point, somewhere, it might happen that there's like that break, there's that weird disconnect or that moving beyond a particular boundary, and we get to choose who we are going to be in that relationship, in that moment, from that point moving on. Meaning, I can choose to say, "Hey, so and so, it really hurt me because I confided this in you and you shared it with someone else when I didn't give you permission to share with someone else. So I want to move forward. I want to find a way to honor our relationship and these boundaries are being established. You can find ways to do that. You also could say, okay, that sucked, that hurt, it's over, moving on. This person is no longer allowed or they don't have access. You keep adjusting that dial. We talked about this in the friendship episode, and it's like that dial keeps getting adjusted. You're choosing the degrees, you're observing, you're moving, you're leaning with it, you're following a organic, natural rhythm of your life as it presents itself to you. You enter into conversation with a new friend and it's like, oh man, this is amazing. I feel so seen, so heard, so cherished. Let's have let's work on this intimacy, let's work on this relationship, and as we do, more gets shared, and then we can grow, and then I can say, yeah, but this is just for me. So we give ourselves the opportunity to access vulnerability in a very smart way, in a way that doesn't necessarily have to mean share everything with everybody all the time. Everyone gets to have access to you just because you exist and you're a human being and you have to be vulnerable. It's not like that. You also don't get to just dump all of this on people and then say, "Well, I'm just being vulnerable. I'm just being truthful. I'm just being honest. I'm just being myself." I don't know when we got into this era of that saying of, "Well, I'm just being my most authentic self, and now you just have to deal with that," or "That's my truth, so you have to deal with it." And it's like, that's not true vulnerability. True vulnerability is, I showed up and I said this and I acted in a way that hurt you, and I take responsibility for that and I'm accountable for it, and let's find a way to move forward. Let's heal this. It's being sovereign. It isn't doing the whole bypassy thing of, well, that's my truth and you just now have to deal with it. That's not vulnerable. That's not empowered. That's not really being in your truth or being truly authentic. It's completely the opposite. It's just a defense mechanism. But I digress. So vulnerability is just this really sweet nectar. Nectar. There's my accent for you. There's the vulnerability is this very sweet nectar that we get to imbibe in. So when we are being vulnerable with others, we're not being vulnerable to expose our bellies and let them do what they will. We're being vulnerable to say, this is me, this is my heart, this is my soul. And I am sharing this willingly, and I'm sharing this with you. And I want to enter into a conversation of what that gets to be like as a lived experience. And my intention for that is to develop this intimacy further. And I'm connected to myself in this moment, and I can see that. And it builds. It builds. It doesn't just get to be an automatic push button. Oh, hi, it's nice to meet you. Push button. Now I'm going to tell you everything about me. I'm going to be as vulnerable as possible because that is what I owe you. That is not. And that's the other thing is you don't owe your vulnerability to anyone. You don't. So if you're a creator, if you're an entrepreneur and you're in the service industry, whether you're a mentor, a coach, a life coach like myself, etc., if you're in this world and you don't want to show up on your Instagram today because you feel like crap and you've been crying all day long and you just can't, then don't. But we have this idea that we have to force ourselves to do this. You have to do this because this is what people want. They want the authenticity, they want the vulnerability. And it's like it's not about them. Your authentic self is saying, I want to be with my loved ones. I want to be under the bed sheets. I want to be watching my favorite TV show and crying all day long and healing my heart and healing my soul and healing my space and giving pause and taking a break and taking a breath and being in a receiving state instead of giving. That's my authentic self and that's my vulnerability, and it gets to be shared here in this way. You don't have to force yourself to then turn on your Instagram camera, show up and do a Facebook Live, cry, and say why you're crying, and let everyone in on the thing. That's not it. Vulnerability is never a forceful thing. You don't have to force your vulnerability. And again, you don't owe it. You don't owe your vulnerability to anyone. You get to choose your vulnerable moments. You get to be present through them. You get to relish in them. You get to fall in love with that freedom to be able to cry in your lover's arms, in your best friend's arms, in your family's arms, and to say, oh, my heart is broken. That it's delightful. Vulnerability is delightful. When it starts feeling performative, when it starts feeling forced, when it starts feeling disconnected, when it starts feeling like a task, when it starts feeling like just one more thing on your to-do list, that's when vulnerability isn't in service to your highest good. It's a reactive state you're entering into because it's a dynamic that you think you have to obey, that you have to follow through on. And at the same time, vulnerability isn't something for you to be afraid of. Remember, yeah, okay, you might be protected. If you don't tell, if you don't choose to grant access to the people in your life, and if you shut down in all regards, at all times, in all ways, from all people, that's a very lonely, very dense, very heavy, very disconnected, very disempowered place to live in, too. So, neither end of the spectrum, neither end of the spectrum, no over doing it, no over and no under, in the middle. Walk that middle. Find the balance, the ebb and the flow. Find that rhythm, that dance. I always say that the balance isn't about standing rigidly still and just like, balance is a dance. When you walk, you're balancing. When you're dancing, you're balancing, and you're entering into this movement and you're finding the steadying space within that movement. And it's the same with vulnerability. You're entering this beautiful movement, and it's fluid and it moves and it expands and it shrinks. And so you want to be mindful. Don't close yourself up so much and walk around believing that you have to be this bulwark, this stone wall, this image of fortitude that is impenetrable all the time. Don't believe that you only get to cry when you're home alone. Don't believe that you only get to be irate when there's proof, or by yourself, that you can only be angry with by yourself. Don't believe that the only part of yourself that you get to share with other people vulnerably is your joy or your successes. Don't believe that that is the only space where you can relish in the space of connection and intimacy with the people in your life. A lot of times we shut down and we cut off access to and for vulnerability because we think we're doing the people around us a service by not bothering them, by not coming off as too much or too needy, by not feeling like a burden. And you're never, ever, 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 it doesn't matter what happens. And I'm saying this to myself as well, because this is one of my core wounds too. But you're never a burden to the people that are meant to be in your life in aligned sincerity with true love that can hold you, that you get to welcome into your world in a healthy, sustainable relationship format. You're never a burden. And we want to see every aspect of who you are. I remember when I must have been like in first grade, and I was getting bullied and I was crying. And I remember one of the teachers coming by and trying to make me feel better. She had the best of intentions, and she was like always so sweet to me. And she said, "Don't cry. You don't look so pretty when you cry." And again, I know that her heart was in the right place. It's just we haven't been taught, number one, how to sit with our emotions and let them be felt without controlling us. Emotional intelligence is so exceedingly important for us to live mindfully, sovereign, fulfilling, deep, loving lives. We need that. It's paramount. So we haven't been taught how to do that. We've been taught to push the unpretty, unladylike, on good girl like emotions to the side. We're supposed to just smile and be happy and look pretty and not ruin our makeup, rather than feel the grit of that emotion and not let it run wild and rampant with us, but for us to sit and watch it and be like, yeah, this is what I'm feeling, and I'm still sovereign over it. We haven't been taught how to do that. And a lot of times we've been taught in order to make it in this world, we have to be tough so that people don't take advantage of us, so that we aren't left in the dark, so that we can continue to be super women. We have everything in our hands and it's up to us. And so therefore, no one can take advantage of us. We can't open the door to our hearts, not completely. And it's so detrimental to our relationships. How many of us sit at home and cry and are miserable and are wishing, oh, if only someone could love me, if only someone could cherish me right now, if only someone had words of advice, but I can't share this with this person because then they'll say this, or they'll think this about me, or they'll look at me a different way and they'll pity me and they'll think that they have to feel sorry for me, and I don't want them to feel sorry for me because I can do it. I can take care of myself. I don't need anyone. I don't like sharing my emotions. I don't like sharing here and telling what my heart feels with other people. Neither one extreme nor the other. If you're shutting down, if you don't know how to allow people into your world, how to share of yourself truthfully, even with the risk of getting hurt, even with the potential of how will they look at me? And the thing is, they'll look at you how they look at you. It doesn't really matter. They're going to misjudge you and they're going to misunderstand you. They're going to misjudge and misunderstand you no matter what. You could be the saintliest of people. You could be the most amazing ruler of the world, mother of dragons. It doesn't matter. They will still see you how they are going to choose to see you because they were determined to see you that way from the first. And so this resistance, this fear, this way of shutting things down because God is forbid anyone ever know, and I'm saying this as someone who did this, right? In a toxic marriage for 12 years. And I wouldn't, there were other reasons that had to do with psychological and emotional internal warfare within that particular relationship and that particular dynamic that kept me from saying things, but I never once told my friends how miserable I was. Because what will they say? What will they think? They'll think I'm pathetic. They'll think I'm a loser. Yeah, I don't want to tell them this. I just want them to see the pretty, awesome, happy, go lucky, smiley Sapha. That's it. And if they see me cry, I want them to just see me cry for only these things and these things alone. And that's very much my prerogative. And it hurt me a lot. And it hurts us. You know, I believe so wholeheartedly in safe spaces for connection as well for this reason. Sometimes we find it a lot easier to be vulnerable and open with complete strangers because we don't internalize what we think that the narrative will be. If we say, oh God, I can't stand my children, or oh my God, my spouse is driving me crazy, or, you know, oh, I've been doing X, Y, and Z. And if we have someone who we don't know, it can feel safer. So when I've led women's circles, for example, that's one of my favorite reasons to lead women's circles to begin with, is that a lot of times when we come together, at least at first, and eventually because we do them for a couple of like weeks or months, then it changes. But when we first get there, there's this really beautiful dichotomy. On the one hand, it's like, oh no, I don't know these people, I don't want to share anything, I don't want them to know anything about me, I don't want them to judge me, I'm so like terrified, I don't know why Safa's making us do these things or say these things or move this way or whatever. And then eventually, little by little, as people start to open, they'll come back and say, oh, my heart is so heavy today, or I've been dealing with this and I just want to be seen. And you get to hear someone else say, yeah, I've experienced this. And someone else affirms and someone else gives you a hug, or someone else, it just depends, right? But because we're building that community, because we're building that safe, because we're giving ourselves the platform, the space, the room, the realm where we can actually be in connectivity and in vulnerability with one another, magic begins to happen. And so much healing takes place, and so much self-understanding. And sometimes it's just seedlings, little things that just kind of sit at the very top surface level. And eventually they'll drop and you'll be like, oh, that's what this meant. That's what that conversation was like. And so I say that to say, one, if you struggle being vulnerable, sometimes the best place to start isn't with your closest people. Sometimes it's finding a women's circle, finding a forum, finding a group that you can safely share in, and allow yourself to notice what that vulnerability is creating and how it's changing you. Sometimes it's recognizing that you do have people in your world who love you and who will receive you, and that you can open up to them. And you can let go of the attachment of, but how will they respond? Just put that out of your mind. Like, you do have people in your world who will receive you, and they will shock you. I will never forget how people responded. My friends, who are like my sisters, every single time, not just with one occasion, not just with one thing, but every single time I would say something to them that was just like I had been eating away at me and at my soul forever. And every single time I said this and shared this with them, the loving response, the support, the lack of judgment, man, that was the medicine that I needed. And then the healing could begin deeper. And then I could do the work on a different level in a different way. And so, again, if you struggle to share in a vulnerable way with the people around you, take it by degrees, do it little by little organically, but consider how completely engulfed you are by that thimble, right? And how much more vast, ample, capacious, wonderful your life would be if you started allowing people in, allowing them to fill your cup back up, allowing them to receive you, allowing them to enter into conversation with them, allowing them to see your non-perfectness, because you're not perfect. No one is perfect. This whole belief that we can only be around each other if I'm at my best. No, like, fuck that. Fuck it. Who the fuck cares? No one is perfect. You want to come to me broken down and like crying and snot running down your face? I say this to my friends all the freaking time. Do not only seek me out when you are fine and happy and in your best self. I don't care. Come to me with your messiness. Come to me with everything. Come to me with your rage. Come to me when you think you're bad company. Come to me at every single one of those points, and I will receive you. I will welcome you. I will love you exactly as you are. And you get to be received and cherished and loved and welcomed exactly at that same level. Exactly at that same level. That's also where intimacy builds. That's how you establish relationships that are long lasting, that go beyond the surface, that are not just, oh, well, we met in high school once and blah, blah, blah. Like, no. How else? How else would you build deeper intimacy? How else would you get to fall in love with your spouse, for example, your partner, your boyfriend, your girlfriend? If you never shared your true, raw, imperfect self with them. I was watching, I guess it was a TV show, and they were making a joke about how this girl wouldn't go to the bathroom in her boyfriend's apartment because she was so ashamed of the fact that she could fart and poop. And then I kind of relate to that to some degree, because I also was this person a little bit, but not to quite that degree. And it's like, dude, if you're really thinking about spending the rest of your life with someone, they're going to see you vomit. They're going to see you, have horrible diarrhea. They're going to see you go through so many imperfect states of self, and they are going to love you through a person who really belongs in your life at that degree, in that way, in that level, in that space, with that much love, who you really are going to be in that realm with, who you're going to create that life with, is going to see that and love you. They're not going to be like, stop crying, you look ugly. No, everything, every part of you gets to be seen, loved, cherished, supported. Every single part of you is worthy. And there is nothing broken about you. Sometimes we don't share vulnerably because we believe that we are broken people. And I am promising you, and I am telling you, and I say this to every single client, and I say this every single time, and I say this to people I don't even know, but you are not fucking broken. No matter what has happened to you in this life, no matter how shattered and fractured and raw you feel, you are still not broken. Not the way that you think. You're not. You're needing light and dark and love and light and space to feel the pain and the rawness and that everything that you are sitting with vulnerably. You're needing to experience that. If you just keep stuffing it down and you keep protecting the people in your life from it, or you keep keeping it from them, you keep restricting that, you're just going to hurt more every single day. Neither one extreme nor the other. Vulnerability is key. You want the most amazing love story, you have to be vulnerable. Not overly so. You want the dream life, vulnerability. The massive bank account, vulnerability. Be vulnerable. Because what if I was going to show up at your door tomorrow with a check for $1 million? And you were like, oh, no, I don't want people to pity me. I don't want them to think that I take handouts. I don't want them to think that I didn't do this on my own. I have to prove that I'm strong enough. I have to prove that I did this. And really? So, yeah, even in that regard, vulnerability is messing with your abundance. If you're not letting yourself be vulnerable, your abundance is going to be stoppered somewhere along the line. Someone gives you a free car, same thing. Explore the realm of being vulnerable and be mindful, be present, be sovereign in that share. Don't just share your vulnerability with the first person you meet and trauma dump on them just because. Don't tell that first date everything about you all the time and everything, but don't give access to everyone in your life all the time. In every way, in every regard. Show up, degrees, adjust the dial, be present, be intentional, seek out the context, understand yourself, love yourself, romance yourself, fall in love with yourself, be vulnerable with yourself. Sometimes that vulnerability is the one that gives us the key to freedom. If you're not vulnerable with yourself, you're never going to realize you're in a toxic space or with a toxic person. You gotta be vulnerable because it takes a lot, because it will say, well, let's put that egoic idea aside for a moment. Let's look at what's really underneath here. And it might hurt, it might sting, and it might not be easy. And it's going to give you options and choices that you may not be super excited about or super happy with, but it is going to change things. And it is going to elevate your life to a degree that just you can't even imagine, but it's worth it. And you have the chance to go there when you are vulnerable. So, food for thought on this beautiful day. And I will be back with you next week. If you want to reach out to me, if you want to ask me any questions, I love your questions. You can email me info@yoursoulfulgoddess.com. You can always join me on socials @yoursoulfulgoddess. And I will see you next week.